Welcome to Advanced Data Queries. This Advanced Data Query section is going to focus on SQL statements. So we'll talk a little bit about advanced queries, and then we'll look at how the SQL tool can help us do advanced queries. We'll look at the SQL tool in general, we'll look at how it handles inputs and outputs, and then we'll talk a little bit about how you can test some of the queries that you create and how you can actually do non-select, and they're not necessarily queries, they're more or less non-select statements. So let's go ahead and get started. So when we're retrieving data, like we talked about in the aggregates, sometimes that data coming back from the database can be fairly complex because we need multiple sources of data and we need to be able to manipulate that data in different ways. So it's also possible to write SQL statements that are fairly complex using the SQL tool. And here to the right we can see a screenshot of a fairly complicated SQL statement where we're selecting things from the person table and we're retrieving and querying for certain types of attributes. We're joining it with multiple other tables. We're then filtering it depending on the role and a second role, and then we're trying to sort it and order it by the full name. So this is a fairly complicated SQL statement, and there can be even more complicated ones with subqueries and things like that. So inside of our SQL statement, there really isn't anything that you couldn't write in SQL as far as a query goes that it couldn't handle. And when we worry about SQL queries, at the top we'll define what the query is, and the query can have input parameters, and then it can have output structures. And we'll talk about these more in just a second, but the definition is at the top. The actual SQL is here inside of the first tab, and then there are several other tabs that will help us work with our SQL query. So this is the overall SQL tool, and we're going to look at a couple of the parts of it as we go along. So the SQL tool itself will allow us to write SQL statements, and it has to define ahead of time what the inputs and the outputs are going to be. So again, in the definition area here at the top, we can define what the input parameters are going to be and then the output entities or structures. The SQL itself and the tab at the bottom is going to be written manually. As you're writing it, the SQL tool will do SQL syntax checking and tell you if there are any errors with the SQL that you're writing. It will also highlight using colors all of the different keywords, any of the different attributes or the entities, including the input parameters and things like that. And the one thing that's important is because you're manually writing the SQL, you do have to know which database you're targeting because the SQL needs to be database specific. So if you're using something like SQL Server and you want to limit the number of rows coming back, you would use top instead of potentially using something like limit for one of the other databases. And when we're actually working with the entities and the attributes inside of the SQL tool, normally we would just say select from this table these types of attributes, but inside of OutSystems we have to kind of abstract the names for the entities and the attributes. So whenever we're worried about a table, we give it the entity name with curly brackets around it, and then we give it the attribute name with square brackets around the attribute. And that's because even when we create an entity and its attributes, and those become tables and columns, the tables and columns don't necessarily have the exact name of the entity and the attribute. OutSystems takes care of creating that for you under the covers, and to make sure everything is unique, a lot of times it adds extra information to be able to keep those things unique. So if we look at the SQL tool, and we mentioned that the SQL itself is sort of what's going to do the work, if that SQL is kind of thought of as a black box, then the input parameters will come in, and then it will run and do what it needs to do in the SQL, and then the output will come out. So we need to define what parameters will be coming in and what the output entity or structure is going to be. So for the output in the entities or the structures, there has to be at least one output to any type of SQL statement, whether it's a query or whether it's what we're going to look at, some of the non-queries. It doesn't matter what it is, just to make the tool consistent, it wants some sort of mandatory output. If we are doing a query and there are a set of columns in a select clause, then the output has to have the same number of columns. And they should be matched if we're using variable names and things like that to make sure that everything is in sync and is meaningful. So when we're doing output, it could either be an entity defined structure or it could be a structure itself. And then the output from the SQL tool is going to be just like it was in an aggregate. The output will contain a list. That list will have the extra attributes like the count, and it will go through the current ones and have the structure. So in this case, we're trying to get products, and there's a price involved. So we're going to pass in the price, and we expect to get products back. So in this case, we're doing a select from the products with all of the columns, with all of the entity attributes from the product entity or table, where the product price is greater than the price that was passed in as the variable. So this is just one way we can go ahead and define these things and how the pieces interact. And you can see that the parameters end up being green when they're passed into the SQL statement. Now, when we go to test things with the SQL tool, we would go ahead and define our SQL in the SQL tab and then move to the test input tab. And because we're taking that price as an input, if we said show me all of the products where the price is greater than 20, we could say go ahead and run that query and don't return any more than 100 records. And when we click on test, it will actually take us to the test output tab. It will show us the different product IDs, the names of the products that are over 20. So when the price is greater than 20, it only found 5 of those, and those 5 have been returned to us. Now there's also an extra tab here called Executed SQL. So when we look at the SQL tool, and I'll go back for a second, the SQL tool is showing us the SQL statement itself. But as I mentioned, product is just a mapping to whatever the real table name is, and price is just a mapping to whatever the real column name is. And OutSystems auto-generates those just to keep them unique. If you want to know what those are, you go into the executed SQL and you can see whatever that mapping is. And even though all of us could go ahead and create this exact same SQL statement, it may be different in my environment than it is in your environment, because under the covers, the way OutSystems generates things to keep them unique will be different. So we're able to test everything to make sure that it's going to work, and we can view the executed SQL to make sure that that's fine as well. Now last, but probably also quite important, is that we can use the SQL tool to do non-select statements. So when we do selects, we're really just making a query from a table. But the SQL tool allows us to do non-select statements, and that includes things like deleting certain records, inserting records, and updating records. So those can be done as part of the SQL tool. For each of the entities, we do have some of these capabilities, but when we're running very advanced queries, and we're joining different entities and we're doing things like that, some of these inserts and deletes can be very helpful, because we can do them across a bulk set of things instead of just doing them all one at a time. So these SQL statements that are deletes, inserts, and updates can be written normally as well. But when we do some of these, like a delete, there's no real output. But we still have to create that dummy output structure to make sure that everything is going to be consistent and run fine. So you can just give it a structure, and whatever the attributes are, it's not going to matter because the delete will still happen. So here we could say, let's just delete all of the products, and we'll give it some sort of structure. If the delete occurs successfully, nothing will come out of the output, but we need some sort of output there just to keep things consistent. Now, if you went through the normal settings and you kind of tried to test this, what you'll find is that when you try to test this, it will actually fail. And that's because while you're in the development environment and you're testing it, if this isn't something that the user and the real app are trying to do, you could accidentally delete all of the products from your test environment. So it won't actually complete the test while it's trying to do that. So that's it for non-SQL queries. So in this session, we talked about the SQL tool and doing some advanced queries. We looked at the inputs and outputs that are important to make sure things are going to map well. We looked at how to test the queries and some of the non-select statements that we can use when we're using the SQL tool. So that's it for advanced data queries focused on the SQL side. Thanks for listening.